Good morning. In the first edition of OPOstories about NBA. It's the first episode in the series when I would like to talk with people who are close to the NBA, sometimes fans who know, so are really close and have got many interesting information about NBA. My first guest is Sam Smith, the Hall of Fame journalist, close to Chicago Bulls, who saw all of these championships. Sam, maybe first question, which was the first season you comment you comment the Chicago Bulls and you were with the team? Which was it? Was it the end of 70s, beginning of 80s? How it was?
It was probably right around when Jordan came. When Jordan was drafted in 1984, I was in the sports department. I had come to the Chicago Tribune in 1979, but as a political writer. I was in Washington, D.C., and I was a sports writer freelance. I used to do freelance magazines, but my main job was politics. And I came to Chicago Tribune in 1979 to help cover the presidential campaign in 1980. And then around 82 or 83, I switched over to the sports department, which was supposed to be temporary. And it wasn't, as I'm still in sports, still do basketball. I work for the Bulls website now. I write for their website, but doing the same as I did for the Tribune, covering the Bulls and the NBA. So initially I was what we called the feature writer, general, and my specialty, one of them was basketball. I wasn't the called the beat writer, which I became later in 1987. But in 1983, I was doing basketball features. And in 1984, when Jordan got drafted, the week he came to Chicago, I spent a day with him in his apartment, writing a feature story. Was at his first game in October of 84. And so I was writing about him when he came. And that's about when I started. Probably in 1983, I had done a story on the minor league, the Continental Basketball Association, and went and spent time. That's how I met Phil Jackson. I went and did a story on the minor league, and he was coaching in Albany, New York. And I met him there and got to know him and wrote about him. And then he ended up in Chicago. So probably from the early 80s and still doing it.
When you met first time Phil Jackson before his NBA career as a coach, did you got this feeling that this coach got something special and could create in the future some successful story in the NBA?
Everybody always says those kind of things that they knew. Now, I grew up in New York City, and Phil was a player for the New York Knicks in the 60s and 70s. And so I remember him. I went to games frequently, and the Knicks were a great team and a popular team in New York. They won championships in 1970 and 73, and Phil was on those teams. So I had watched him as a player. I didn't know him personally, but I had seen him play. But then when I met him and I watched him in the Continental Basketball Association, I really did think he would be a great coach, because for one reason, he was intelligent. He'd written books. They were controversial, but his memoir, Maverick, about his playing days, was controversial at the time. It wouldn't be if you looked at it now. But he had a lot of success in the minor leagues, and he'd had it in the way those minor leagues worked. Teams turn over a lot. Players go up to the NBA. They go play in Europe. And I'm sure, as you saw, what we say overseas, they change teams. And he was able to sustain success with so many different groups of players, won a championship. And so I did feel he had something special. And when I got to know him in Chicago, actually, a friend of mine was the owner of the Milwaukee Bucks then, and I had recommended Phil to Milwaukee as a coach. He had not, he's still an assistant with the Bulls, but I had told my friend who owned the Bucks, Herb Kohl was also a U.S. Senator. I said, I believe he's going to be a great coach. I didn't think he was going to win 9 or 10 titles like he did, but I felt he had a unique ability to work with people. And part of that was his background. He grew up, his family were Pentecostal ministers. And so he grew up in this sort of congregation atmosphere around people, worked the Native American tribes in Montana where he grew up. So he had a real feel for humanity that I thought would, and he was also very knowledgeable in basketball. And I felt that would project.
Mm-hmm. And what about Michael Jordan? Because you mentioned that you were with Chicago Bulls from the beginning of Michael Jordan in the NBA. How did he change during that time from the rookie season till for the first championship season?
Michael really didn't change at all. I mean, it's sort of everything kind of changed with him. He came in this incredibly, I mean, obviously the big basketball ability, had success, in the Olympic team in 1984 that won a gold medal. It was the last collegiate team that won a gold medal. They did in '88, and then they brought the pros in after too. He made a championship shot for North Carolina. Won a collegiate championship. So he had success as a player, and nobody anticipated he could reach the level of player he became. But everyone knew he would and should be a great player. But he had this incredible competitive nature about him from the beginning. Wanted to compete, demanding, and he sort of brought along the rest of the team. Not everybody's like that, and that really was unique about him, because frankly, they say, well, Jordan was the greatest player ever, but there were always players who could do anything better than him. Players who could shoot better and pass better and rebound better. But not only he can combine all those skills, but he had this incredible competitive nature about him, and this not only this ability, but this desire to compete relentlessly, and not only to beat you, but always be there, never miss games, competed incredibly, played tremendous amounts of minutes, practiced as hard as he played, and that was an attitude and a mindset that he forced on the Bulls and their other players. Rather than him changing for them, they changed for him, and that's how they became champions. Mm-hmm. They had good teams, and they had a lot of talent in different years, but never had that person with that kind of attitude to bring it all together.
Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why I ask you about appearing in my podcast is that book is a Polish edition.
Okay.
Yes,
I didn't know that.
Second edition from 2020, from September. And I must say that I read it on February this year, and I've got two why. Why is for myself, why I hadn't read it before, and I wait till 2020. And the second why...
You're young.
And the second...
a long time ago.
No, not so young. I remember those, the second, The Last Dance, it was
right.
mid-90s. And right. It was time when I, to be honest, wasn't Chicago Bulls fan. I would say that if I've got this book in the mid-90s or at the end of 90s, when I was, stubborn youth lad, I think that with pleasure I will read it, but in a different context. The question why is for you, why it was so controversial? Because when I read this book, I see Michael Jordan not only as a superhero, super basketball player with this all attitudes as you mentioned, but also as a human, which makes this book special. Why it was so controversial in USA?
Well, I saw it exactly like you read it. I mean, I wrote it that way, and I thought it was that way. But I was a little naive about how it would be received. Uh-huh. And it was because, and I assume it's the same way in Europe, but people tend to want to make heroes of their favorites. Mm-hmm. and they want to make them really devoid of human characteristics. They don't want to see them with weaknesses.
Yes.
They don't want to see them losing. They don't want to see them vulnerable. And so Jordan was, very cleverly marketed, and it was really the first unique and big marketing of an athlete, really, in America. I never remember anything like that. Maybe Babe Ruth in the early 20th century, but even though I look at, I wasn't born then. A lot of our heroes are sort of anti-heroes. Muhammad Ali.
Mm-hmm.
When I grew up, Jackie Robinson was the first Black to play baseball. Was not, America being a pretty racist country, was not particularly welcomed in the late 40s when he started.
Mm-hmm.
He was more where I lived in New York City, but so anyway, so these weren't national heroes, but Jordan was kind of built up to be that way. And what they did in their marketing was very clever. And they associated him with what we consider all American products. Americans have this egotism about being special.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure I don't know, maybe other countries do. And of course it's exaggerated and not true, but everybody likes to think they're special. And so he was associated with, pure kind of all American products, the right cars and the right foods and the right shows. And so I wrote this book, which was the same thing. I felt it would show, that he basically, person, he was a good guy, great player, but he was not perfect, and there was this humanity about him, and people were outraged about it,
Mm-hmm.
and angry, and about it was, and I understood that. I remember, I don't know if you know, these people. Willie Mays was a famous baseball player, one best ever in the United States, still alive.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Bouton was a pitcher
Mm-hmm.
for a team, and wrote like a diary of a season back in the 1970s. And he wrote about the New York Yankees, who were the most famous team, and Mickey Mantle, and wrote some things about how they behaved and, how things went on. These are all, these are kids, young kids, and acting out. And the baseball players, I remember seeing Willie Mays on the nighttime variety show being interviewed about it. And he said, "Oh, I hate this book. It's called Ball Four." He said, "I hate this book." And so the host said, "Well, which part do you hate?" He said, "Well, I didn't read it. I know I hate it." And I think I experienced a lot of that too. Roy Williams, I saw on TV, was condemning me and criticizing me, and Bobby Knight and Mike Ditka, football hero type from Chicago. And I'm sure they hadn't read the book, but they just heard, that somebody was attacking Jordan, or it was viewed as an attack on Jordan, which it wasn't. As anybody who would read it, it was an explanation of sort of not only his humanity, but the humanity of a team and a group put together over a year, and how it worked through, how they work through the positives and negatives, and all the dynamics of human interaction.
Mm-hmm.
But it was sort of depicted as, and then there were other elements to it. Part of it was, there was some jealousies. The other media in Chicago, the other news, I worked for Tribune, and the other media in Chicago, the Chicago Sun-Times, saw it as an opportunity to sort of get in a competitive situation. They were the lesser, smaller newspaper, and it got built up in Chicago. Chicago has kind of a history of losing sports teams, and its name, it's called the Second City, is one nickname for Chicago. And Chicagoans tend to have like an inferiority complex about their city, because it's what we call in the United States a flyover. People in the United States are focused on the Eastern Coast, New York, Washington, and the West Coast, San Francisco and Los Angeles. And so the rest of the country is just, you fly over it and look down on. And so Chicagoans, sort of have this second city mentality, like New York's number one, or LA. And so here was, finally, and the Chicago Cubs baseball were known as a losing team, lovable loser kind of thing. And the Chicago teams always had a reputation for, losing spectacularly or blowing, whatever. And so here, finally, the Bulls win a championship. The book came out right after they won the championship.
Yes.
I mean, I was just lucky that I the right time. I just, serendipitously happened to pick that season to just do a diary. I didn't think they were going to win a title. I mean, you can't predict it. If I knew that, I would go bet a lot of money in Las Vegas and wouldn't have to work doing an exercise. And so the book comes, they win the title. The book comes out, and the narrative became, this book is going to destroy the team because it revealed all the inner workings, and now Chicago will never win again. So the community now is outraged about me because I brought down the Chicago Bulls. Now, fortunately, that dissipated pretty quickly because they went and won, and they kept winning. So that sort of went away. But that's part of why people were angry, I think.
So I guess that for some of Bulls fans and Chicago community treat you like a black sheep, persona non grata. Was it for how long this state was? Because usually if there's some big situation or somebody did something wrong in their opinion, they need sometimes weeks, months, and everything came to the normal life. Another situation came, another controversial situations. How difficult was it for you, and how long does it take that you wasn't this bad guy who want to destroy the Bulls in their mind?
Right. It probably was more difficult for my wife. We just had a small child at the time, so he was unaware. It was difficult for her. It wasn't so much for me because I had the advantage of knowing it was true. And when you have the truth on your side, and the community didn't know it was true. They didn't think it was, the Jordan said it's not true. And of course, years later, everyone has now admitted, yes, it was true. And so, they, like in The Last Dance, they explained, well, yeah, Jordan said, yeah, I was a jerk, but that's what I had to do to push him to win. And everyone goes, yeah, of course. Well, it wasn't the notion back then. But a couple of things. One was, I knew it was accurate. I knew, people said, and there's been this canard over the years that Horace Grant was this source of it, which is nonsense, because if you read the book yourself, you see most everybody's quoted on the record. It's not sources. It's not, it's not anonymous sources. Players are quoted by name. So, there was that, they were all, for the most part, on the record. And also I had been, when I started in journalism, like I said, I was a government reporter, but I was also an investigative reporter. I did investigative projects and about government, and there were indictments, and people lost, got elections or whatever. And so I had been in these situations before. And my first editor in a newspaper in Indiana, where I worked my first journalism job, Ernie Williams, when I investigated, he taught me a very valuable lesson. It was difficult, but he said, when you write something about someone, each time when any of my investigative stories would come out, on the first day, he would make me go see that person I'd written about and accused of something, and say, well, you've got something to say, I'm right here. In other words, stand behind your work or stand in front of it. And so that's what I did. The first day the book came out, I went in the locker room, and I walked up to Jordan and I said, I'm going to be here. I'm still covering the team. If you got any problems with me, let me know. And he never said anything to me. And to his credit, he didn't like it, because, my personal belief is he's never read it. I don't know that for sure, but I doubt he has. Didn't like what was being said about it, and a lot was being taken out of context, as people complain to journalists all the time. But to his credit, he always dealt with me professionally after that. He was mad at me, and we'd had a good relationship. I'd been traveling with the team several years, and they didn't travel separate from us. They didn't have a charter plane. I was on the plane with them. It was all commercial. We were in the same hotels, bus, everything. We were together all the time. And I was friendly with him, not close, but when you're on the road, I had dinner with him several times. I played golf with him, different things over the years, which I did with other players too. And journalists, when you're on the road, you just together because you're together basically for 8 or 9 months.
Yes,
traveling back and forth like that. So I understood that I wasn't going to win any battle with Michael Jordan, whether I was right and he was wrong. It didn't matter. He's
rather not, because for sure he will come back to you.
But he always he treated me professionally. I was still going to be around, and I had to ask him questions. I wouldn't joke around with him or talk privately as I had before, but I'd ask him questions in the group and he would answer me just as he would answer anyone else. He never made an issue of it, like a lot of players do and still do. Russell Westbrook, you see him start with reporters. Just this last week, Devin Booker started with I saw a Greek journalist was on one of the Zoom calls that he was kind of making fun of. And Jordan, nobody would have been mad at him for doing that. I mean, the journalists were mad at me, also. So, if somebody has something, successful or special, is anger, jealousy, whatever the case might be. I mean, I did have a lot of other journalists, but I wasn't going to put it this way. They would rather have Jordan on than me. So, I mean, I didn't initially. There were some threats, and for the first week after the book came out, the newspaper had told me to stay home because there were a lot of threats. But it wasn't like the internet now and social media, and people had to write a letter to
yes.
or call a newspaper, and so it wasn't quite as intense as probably it would have been now. So the first week or so, I kind of they kept my head down, as it were. And then just went to work, and nobody pretty much bothered me after that. And I just did my job. And eventually, I think by the end of that next season, when they won again, it kind of dissipated because there were some. Now, I still run into people who'll say to me, when I was a kid, I really hated you and stuff like that. But the fact I won again that second year. And so the main narrative that I had destroyed the team, proved inaccurate. I think the community sort of relaxed and, went on to hating other people.
You were champions, so they forget about this.
Right, exactly.
Maybe they treat it like something which makes the team stronger, and like Phil Jackson, you probably
right. And so they changed the narrative and said, this as that evolved to that over the years, that this helped, and felt on some level Phil Jackson used it to bond the team. To say, well, here the outsiders, don't trust these guys because look at that. Write a book about you. You can only trust me and the coaches and your teammates. And I did think he did. I know he did that, because other players told me he would bring that up occasionally, in meetings and say, see now. And Phil and I were friendly, and we were always friendly. But at the same time, he felt he could use it for the benefit of the team, and I was fine with that. Because he did one time. They asked him that season about the book. He said, I would never read that book. He said, I read like 30 pages and through. Years later, I never said anything to him. Years later, one day we were having lunch and he said, I read the book. I liked it. So, but he said, I couldn't say that.
So maybe you were new Detroit Pistons, when Pistons gone with their chances to beat the Bulls. Now your book, and you made this book, and you maybe for Phil Jackson got the same function that look, there is some Smith that he's not right. I've got also a question about how the journalism changed during the years, how it looked in the 80s, 90s, and how it looks today. And would it be easy or even possible to write this kind of book in the 20th, in 21st century?
No, you couldn't write this kind of book, and not because they're not capable journalists. There are journalists who couldn't write, authors and people who would write better than I can. But the access that existed then is thing, but the access is completely changed. There's no access anywhere really. What was different about the NBA was much different. The NBA was, was just a lesser league. In 1983, when they inaugurated the salary cap, put that first ceiling on maximum salaries, basically, there were about half dozen teams about to go bankrupt. That's why they did it. That's why the players. And so this is about when I'm starting. The NBA, our championship games in the finals were often on tape delay. They didn't always have sponsors and networks wanting to televise their playoff games. I mean, so you could imagine how different that is to now. So as a result, the players, were not paid very well. Mm-hmm. And so, they didn't have the independence they have now. The players talk about themselves now as corporations. They talk about themselves, my brand. And, they have, even 10, 15 years ago, I remember Ben Gordon. He was a player with the Bulls, like 07, whenever it was. He had a guy who Chicago's very cold in the winter. During practice, he would sit in Ben's car and let it run because Ben, after practice, didn't like to get into a cold car. And he was paid $100,000 a year. And this was, it was making more than I was. Uh-huh. Ben, and, all he's doing is driving around and keeping his car warm. And this is 10, 15 years ago. You can imagine now with the incredible increase in salaries and revenues in the NBA. So, all the players have staffs and trainers and cooks and all sorts of things. And, it's very rare that you see players together on the road. I mean, this year, not at all because of the virus, and they're not allowed to. But before this year, teammates would not go out together very often because they had their own groups of people to be with. And you never saw a team, groups of players together where you always did back in the 80s, because that's who they were. And so, like I mentioned before, I had this unusual access. We traveled together. So the rule back then in the NBA was you had to get the first flight available, out of the city you were in. So you would avoid getting in late or whatever if there's delays. So we would always be, getting up at 5 o'clock. We'd have to be at the airport at 6 o'clock, waiting for 7 o'clock flight. And so, here's this, group of traveling team, and, me and a couple of other journalists are with them, with a couple of coaches, maybe 20, 25 at the most people. And we're just waiting for our planes. We get to the next city. We all get on the bus together. We go to the same hotel, and, on a day off, they don't have family with them. They're not traveling with family or friends. They can't afford. Jordan was the only one occasionally would have friends with him. He had 3 friends from North Carolina who he grew up with. They used to meet him on the road occasionally, but they couldn't afford to travel all the time. A lot of times, and he never liked to be alone. He always liked, for card games, and the guy never slept. It was amazing. I remember even Magic Johnson telling me at the, and I knew this stuff from being with him, but at the Olympics in '92 in the Dream Team, that they would play cards all night, and Jordan would be playing cards and wouldn't want anyone to go to sleep. And he'd be the last one, and they finally at 5 o'clock, everybody's would go, and he's still wanting. And at 7 o'clock, he's up meeting another group. And it was this remarkable constitution he had that he almost never needed sleep. And I'm sure that has something to do with the way he could play basketball. And so he would, we'd get if his friends weren't on the road with him. I remember Atlanta, a lot of times he would just ask me and another journalist who he was friendly with to come up to his room just to play cards. He would get to play ping pong. He'd get him to bring a ping pong table to the room, and just to have some company, to do stuff a lot of times. So, I mean, there's nothing like that anymore. You're just never in a situation like that with athletes, just because, the leagues have become so big and profitable that they've created instances with media and all these rules. These rules didn't exist. Like now, the rule, again, this year there's no stadium access, and I haven't been to any games this season because you can't be near the players. But before this year, they keep changing the rules to limit the access. So pregame, the locker room would be open, for 30 minutes now, what it is now, 30 minutes.
Okay.
But there's separate rooms all over the arena for, training and lift weights and, take. Well, all that was in one room before. And it was, the trainer was in there taping their feet at their line. And there was just one room. And we would be in it, and there was no limitation. Like, you had to be out of it, 45 minutes before the game started. But you could come. I mean, I would sit with Jordan for 2 to 3 hours before every game. He liked to get there early. He didn't like to shoot before games because the crowd would build up. He just liked to sit and so he'd get there 3 o'clock, and I'd see him 3, 4 o'clock. Game was at 7:30, and he'd sit for 3 hours and talk to anybody, not just me. Didn't matter. He just liked to, talk, gamble, bet on stuff, whatever. And so, so you can't have the access I had to do that diary doesn't exist anymore.
What was really interesting when I read your book is that some of the, maybe not statements, but what the players said, it looks like it was a private conversation, but then it was information that it was from press conference. And when you compare it to current NBA, sometimes when I hear that the players, it looks like more like some kind of PR statements. We talk about only some facts, not to tell too much, not about emotions, not about some locker room stories and so on. Of course, we've got this kind of times that NBA, it's much more like like a company, big company, huge company. And in the 80s, it was the beginning of the popularity, the David Stern work, the MJ appear, it was Showtime versus Boston Celtics time. So it was much more different. But I guess that for you who used to work with the players and talk with them in the different level, it's much more difficult. And now, especially in the COVID times, how it looks like, how do you contact with the players? Is it only like we are talking now via Zoom, or is there also something changed to talk with via cell phone?
You mean this season now? Now it's just Zoom. I have not done anything with players this season. I did 1 or 2 interviews by telephone, Zach LaVine, because of All-Star, but that's rare. Basically, we do everything by Zoom this season. Like I said, I haven't been. This is there, since 19. And I would go to games. I mean, this is the first time since like the 60s I haven't been in an arena, during a season. Because when I was a kid growing up, I would go to games all the time. Grew up in New York City, and so I'd go to see the Madison Square Garden, all the great players, Will Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Oscar Robertson come in. I would, get to see him. And then over the years, as I got older and, working in others, I was still going to games as a fan, and then freelance journalism. When I was working in Washington as a political writer, remember I covered Magic Johnson's McDonald's high school championship game, All-Star game for a freelance story. So I'd stayed, interested in sports, but not as a business. But even before the virus, last couple of years, now part of it is my age. They see me now as a grandfather. I mean, at one time I was sort of a peer, with players, and I was a little bit older, but not that much. Then I had a period where I was closer with the coaches because they were those were the guys I knew in my age group, and so now the players, I'm I'm a lot older than the players, so. I like the game. I like being around. I like the writing and everything. So I'm glad to be still working, but I don't really develop relationships with players particularly anymore. I view the game more as an observer. Just I've seen it so much, and I know what they're doing, and I don't have to ask them. But you're right in what you're saying. Anything when it becomes more valuable, it becomes more protected, and people are more worried about losing it. Back in the 80s, they weren't worried about what they said or whatever with the NBA. It was, it was almost like a barnstorming league. It was still a league, but, and it was a big deal to be a pro basketball player. But economically like it was. Now, even I did a book a couple of years ago about the NBA in the 60s and 70s. And, those guys, and this famous players, Oscar Robertson and Jerry West, they had second jobs in the off season. I mean, they needed to supplement their income by working in the off season. That's even the stars. Oscar Robertson worked for Pepsi Cola company in the off season, and he was one of the highest. So and that's not that long ago. That's still into the 1970s. And so, but in the 80s, when the NBA is starting its growth, it's still, when you're just starting, even like say when you're young, you don't realize how important whatever you be doing, because you don't know it's going to become, like startup now or whatever. It's working in the garage or a band or something, and all of a sudden you become the Rolling Stones or something. But you don't know you're going to be the Rolling Stones. You're just a bunch of kids messing around, and it's so
music.
NBA does. And so I like the NBA, because the NBA was always, and probably because it wasn't as big, it was the most open league of all. Football is very militaristic in our country, and very closed down. Baseball, kids come from a lot of rural areas. They play in the minors in small towns a lot. Whereas the NBA players tend to be more sophisticated, more urban. They come from cities. They played high school and college. They played from big stars when they're still teenagers. So I always found NBA players much more interesting to be around as the athletes, more open, willing, to be honest, willing to, talk about what was going on. And so that's part of the reason I gravitated toward the NBA. I like the people, and I like their openness, and I like the ability to communicate that doesn't exist in other sports.
Also, the last year in the bubble shows that NBA is different than the other sports leagues, but it's the other topic. But I'm really curious, when we are talking about the Chicago Bulls in 2020-21 season, you mentioned about Zach LaVine. Do you think that because he's developing each year in Chicago, especially in Chicago, he's a star, he's a leader, but do you think that he's the leader who could bring Chicago back to the playoffs and to the different level?
So I think he can be that player. I mean, I think they're getting close to that level now of, competing for the playoffs. This season, this week is the break. Is going to be the All-Star game on Sunday. So this is sort of the halfway mark of this season. And they're sort of in the mix. I think they're ninth or something, and they're going to have a play-in. But the team's like fourth. They're like a game or two behind fourth. And so all these teams are mixed up in there. It'll depend on what happens, injuries or illness in the second half. And, the virus is dissipating a lot. A lot of people are getting vaccines now. And, so I think there's more normalcy returning. A lot of the teams are having fans starting to come back to the arenas. But I think, the Bulls are an incomplete team. LaVine is a star player, not just because he made an all-star. He's played like that. Now, the disadvantage you have of playing in Chicago is everybody gets compared to Jordan. And I remember having this conversation with Kobe Bryant, who I knew pretty well, and I would have lunch with him when he would come to Chicago. And I asked him one time about all the comparisons between him and Jordan. Did he ever think, he could surpass that? And he said, no. He said, I can't. And he said, not because I couldn't win 7 titles or I couldn't win more scoring championships, but he says Michael is like an urban legend. Nobody ever thinks he missed a shot. Nobody ever thinks he did anything wrong. He lost a game. And it is like that. And so when you play in Chicago, as good as you get, you're always compared to Jordan. They say, well, Zach, he's averaging 28 points, but he missed his shot at the end of the game. And I would say Jordan in 1986, they were 41-41, and he missed shots at the end of the game all the time. But nobody remembers that. All I know is the titles and all the great shots and, the winning shots. Nobody shows, him making turnovers, missing free throws. He didn't do a lot, but he did it. I saw it plenty of times. It took him 7 years before they won a title. They were a 500. His first 10 playoff games, he lost 9. He was 1-9. And, so He didn't win all the time, but nobody thinks that. And so, if, you're Chicago, you can't match up against that. So Zach LaVine, spectacular player, and I think they could build a great team around him. Mm-hmm. But parts now. I mean, basically, they need a point guard, a small forward, and a center. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're missing 3 starters. When they have that, then I think he can be that player, but he can't now.
Do you think that Kobe White got the chance to develop to this level that you could cut the point guard from the Chicago Bulls needs list?
No, I don't think he could be a starting point guard in the NBA. I think he could be a really good 6th man. Mm-hmm. Like Jamal Crawford, like Lou Williams, off the bench. But not every point guard's the hardest position to be, because not only you have to score, but you have to see the floor, see other players, movement. He doesn't see that. He's never going to see that. It's like American football, quarterback is the most important position, and you're either that or you're not. Either you see the whole field and you see things are happening. I'm sure it's the same in soccer. Either you see the players developing or you don't. You don't learn that. Mm-hmm. And the same thing in point guard. You even have a feel for how to, like chess, a couple of moves ahead, or you don't. You could study. I could study for 100 years and I'm not going to get that. You just, mm-hmm. And he doesn't see that. He's never going to see it. Doesn't mean he's not a good player, and it doesn't mean he's not going to have a good role in Chicago, but it's not going to be as the point guard. So they're going to have to get one. And he'll have to move up to another position.
Mm-hmm. And how much Chicago Bulls change in this season, especially that they've got new coach, new executive. For sure, they've got more wins. And from your perspective as a journalist and also, I guess, Chicago Bulls fan, how it looks?
Well, I try not to be a fan, actually. I write for the Bulls website, but the only way I can really do my job well is to be independent, and I'm not an employee of the team. They just buy my work independent. I do other work, write books and things like that. So you end up rooting for them because you get to know the people. And so I hope they succeed. But yeah, I think they have, and it's a process everyone goes through when they do what they did. They wanted to, start over again, change, and now I think they've made that next a competitive team. Now they still need to get more talent. They still need to fill in some spots, but now they're like in the last couple of years, when they won a game, I think they were surprised they won a game. Mm-hmm. Now when they lose a game, I think they're surprised. They feel like they should win. Mm-hmm. So that's a step a team takes.
Culture.
They haven't. Right. This culture, but it's it's competitiveness, confidence, feeling success. They've intermingled some veterans with the young players, and so a coach. They've got an experienced coach now. The previous 2 coaches it was their first head coaching job, so they've got an experienced coach, and so I think they've taken a step to be a more credible team, a more competitive team. And that's the first step. The next step is, the starting to win games on a regular basis. And that requires having some more better players.
Mm-hmm. Last question, for sure, from your wall behind, I see that you are a Chicago Bulls fan. What about comics? Because I see the cover in the frame. Superman
was my comic book growing up. And so I got that. I also have the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Uh-huh. Those are other favorite reading items of mine. So yeah, well, I also got Snoopy comic book from Charles Schultz, Peanuts. But yeah, I was a fan of the Superman comics growing up. Always followed that. As a kid. I don't read them much anymore. But it's a nice memory to have around.
Yeah, that's right. I asked because I also a comics fan, and I started the journey with comics, with of course some Polish and European authors, but also with Spider-Man, X-Men, Batman. So
Yeah,
when I saw, so I guess that it's Superman.
Superman. Yeah, well, and I'm not sure what psychologically that means, but Superman, he was the win. He was the best.
Yes.
I mean, he was the only invincible. I know kryptonite and all that sort of stuff, and you had to make a story. But of all those others, they had flaws. And he, in theory, was the invincible one. So I kind of like that. Now I don't know what that says about me, but I'm sure somebody could do a psychological analysis on that too. I just like the picture.
That's all. Sam, thank you very much for the conversation about past and present of Chicago Bulls with some accent about future. So thank you very much for your time for my podcast and Polish fans, and have a good night.
All right, good to talk to you and good to meet you. I hope it works out for you.
Thank you very much. Have a nice night. Goodbye.